Hello and welcome to economics class. As we have seen during our previous class about the differences between economics as a science subject and other sciences subjects like physics, chemistry, geography, and others. Economics has society that contains human beings as its own laboratory. This is quite different from other science subjects that they have their own laboratories where objects and other variables are being kept for study. But in the case of economics, it is different. So as we see society as the laboratory that contains human beings, and through the interaction of these human beings that we have information or data, definitely we need tools that we should be using or adopting to analyze, explain, describe, and forecast any phenomenon that is happening in the society concerning the economy of that society. Any given region or a country or a continent or even the world at large, we need information so that we can explain or describe the behavior of human beings toward resources, how resources are being composed, how resources are being used to drive satisfaction of human needs. Now, as we have seen in our just past class, we have table. Table as a tool that we use to analyze information that we got from individuals. This table contains columns and rows. Apart from table, we also have frequency table, which has similarities with the normal table that we have because it contains the columns and rows. But the only difference in terms of frequency table is that it represents individual item of the observation and the frequencies, that is the number of the appearance of each item of the observation. Today, we are going to see another tool that we use to describe the behavior of human beings. Now, we have charts. When we say chart, we mean it is the representation of data for visualization. And what we mean by visualization of the data is to make the information in the text more visible so that any reader that comes across this information will find it easy to access, easy to understand, and simple to interpret. So chart, as I said, is the representation of data by using symbols. So we use symbols to make the text or to make the information in the text more visible to any reader or any person that is studying information about economics. Now, in chart, as I said, we are using symbols. We have the one that contains bars. So you may have a diagram containing bars like this. The bars may have gaps between them. So this is what we call a bar chart. As you can see, we have rectangular bars on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, we have another variable. So in the length of each bar represent the value of the variable. And now, as I said, each rectangular bar here represents the value of a variable. And what we mean by variable is any quantity that is subject to change or that can take different values. For example, price. We know that price is not the same. Price of goods and services are different. So price is considered to be a variable. For example, goods. The good that we can see and we can touch is also a variable. And we have another example, which is interest. That is the amount of money being imposed on any loan that is given to an individual person or a corporate body is another variable. So these are examples of variables. So when we have information that contains this variable and we want to show the relationship between the variables, then we engage ourselves in drawing a diagram or a chart that will give us a description about the relationship between these variables. So chart takes different form. A bar chart is not the only chart that we use to plot any data. Apart from bar charts, we have another one, which is histogram. Histogram is similar to bar chart, but the only difference is that in histogram, as it contains rectangular bars, it has no gap between the bars. So as we draw it, we don't leave any gap between it. And histogram contains only one individual or one variable. So what histogram tries to tell us is that it studies a variable over a time. That means it doesn't try to show the relationship between variables. It only tries to show us how the variable takes place over a period of time. For example, an economic test is conducted in a class. So this test is one single variable because we don't assume all the students to have one score. Definitely the scores will vary. So we consider the scores to be variable. So when we try to draw histogram, we try to show how individual item of that test appears. Does it appear once or does it appear more than once? So the length of each bar in histogram will tell us this information. Now, apart from histogram, we have another chart, which is pie chart. Pie chart is a circular representation of data that contains slides. So each variable is having or is allocated with a slide. For example, it looks like this. Now, as we have variables, each one will have its own slide. And we know that a cycle contains 360 degrees. So we divide it like this, for example. Now we have each portion contains 190 degrees. So depending on the size of the variable we have, then we can decide which slides that variable will contain. For example, if a variable has small size, then the slide will be small. If it has large size, like this portion, then it can have a large size on the pie chart, depending on its value, as I said. This is another size, or this is another slide of a variable. So this is a pie chart. We are going to see detail about how to draw a bar chart when we have an example of it. Now, apart from pie chart, then we have line chart. A line chart is another representation of data that we use to visualize, or we use to make the data visible by using line. So when we have, can take different forms. As we have seen, it can slope downward, as in the case of demand. It can also slope upwards, as in the case of supply. So this is another line chart. And it can also slope vertically without taking any shape. So this is another line chart. Depending on the information that we have, will determine the size of the line. And it can slope flatter. So anyone that we have tries to give us a clear picture about the information that we have in the text. Without it, that information will be difficult or confusing to understand. But with the help of a chart, it will help us understand the information that we have in that text. Now, we have an example of a table that contains information about the number of students from the SS1 to SS3 in a given secondary school. And we are asked to draw a bar chart so that we can have a clear representation of this data and for easy and quick understanding of the data. Even though the data is organized in a tabular form, but we need to make more clarification about this data. So we engage ourselves in constructing a bar chart. Now, if you are going to construct the bar chart for this information, the first thing we are going to do is to look at the variables that we have. The first one, we have class. The class is the first variable that we have. JSS1, JSS2, JSS3, SS1, 2, 3. And on the second column, we have the number of students. The number of students, as you see, varies. In JSS1, we have 10 students. In JSS2, we have 20 students. In JSS3, we have 30 students. In SSS1, we have 20 students. In SS2, we have 40 students. And finally, in SS3, we have 15 students. So the first thing we are going to do in constructing a bar chart is to draw the y-axis. Then we draw the x-axis. And here we have 0. That is where they intersect. Now, the next thing we are going to do is to decide which class interval we are going to allocate on the y-axis so that we show the length of each bar. Now, as we see, the difference between each class is 10. So if we try to put 10 as the difference in the variable here, I think it will be okay. So we put 5 as difference in each class. For example, we'll start with 5 here. 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50. So this y-axis represents the number of students, while the x-axis will represent class. So we start with the JSS1. JSS1 contains only 10 students. So the length of our bar will correspond 10. So this one represents JSS1. Then JSS2 contains 20 students. Then we have to look for 20. 20 is here. Then we draw our bar here. So we have JSS2. Then the next one is JSS3, which contains 30 students. So JSS3 is here. JSS3. The next class is SS1. SS1 contains 20 students. So this one is similar to JSS2. Each one contains 20 students. So the length of the bar will correspond that of JSS2 because they have the same number of students. SS1 is SS2, which contains 40 students. So SS2 is this area. The length will be here. SS2. And lastly is SS3, which contains 15 students. So this is 15. 15 student SS3. So here we write the number of students. And this one, the classes. So class, this is a bar chart. So as you can see, this one is more clear than the one we have in a table. And in some cases, you have the information just in the text without even putting it in a tabular form, and you'll be asked to draw a bar chart. So this is how to draw a bar chart. As I said, histogram is another chart that contains bars, but in this one, it doesn't have any space or gap between the bars because it studies only one single variable. So it doesn't try to show the relationship between the variables. As we are going to see in this example, which we have taken the height of student in a given class. So the height is the variable because the students are not of the same height. Some are tall while some are short. So as we have this information, we try to measure the frequency of the height because some students can be of the same height. So when we have a height that repeats itself, definitely it will have more frequency than the one that doesn't repeat itself. So when we try to reflect on the frequency of each item of the observation, then we engage in drawing a histogram. Now, as you can see, we have an example of a class of students that we measure their height. As you can see, the first one, we have 3 students that have 3 feet. The next one, we have 4 students that have 4 feet of height. The next one, we have 6 students that have 5 feet of height. Then we have 8 students that are 6 feet of height. Then we have 10 students that have 7 feet of height. The second to the last is 5 students having 8 feet of height. And lastly, we have 2 students having 9 feet of height. So when we try to plot this information on histogram, the first thing is we draw the vertical axis or y-axis on which we put the frequency. Then we plot the horizontal axis that we have the height of the student. Now, from this information, we have 3 students that have 3 feet of height. So as you can see here, even though this number is invisible, but you know that the difference between 4 and 2, this area will be 3, definitely. Then we have 4 students that have 4 feet of height. So this one corresponds the frequency, which is 4. The next one is 5 students having 6 feet of height, which correspond with our frequency. So we take this direction up to the last one, which we have 2 students that have only 9 feet of height, so it corresponds with our frequency. Now, the next thing we are going to do is the guidelines or the guide on how to draw the histogram. The first thing, as I said, is to draw the vertical line or the y-axis. This one must contain the frequency. Otherwise, it will mislead us in describing the data. The second thing is to draw the horizontal axis, which will contain the variable with which we are going to show the frequency. Then we have to use the width. The width of each bar must be the same. As you can see here, based on this example, I think the width is the same. So there should be no bar that will contain the width that is smaller than others or that is bigger than others. Then we have to use appropriate scale. For example, like this one, in this one, we have the frequency. So you will look at the number of frequencies we have, which one is highest. The highest one here is 10. So definitely we know that our scale should not be less than 10. So it has to be either 10 equal to the highest number of the frequency, or it has to be above it a little, so that we know which kind of scale we are going to use. So in some instance, we can use 1 as a scale. That means if we are using 1, then we can write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to 10. But in this case, we use 2. So as you can see, the difference in the scale is 2. We have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12. So that is the scale we use. So definitely by using appropriate scale, it will help us to draw a good and clear histogram.